Should grantmakers use AI to make grant decisions?
There is a lot of very genuine concern about AI being used to replace human decision making. There's also a fear that AI could be adopted before an agency really understands the technology and has the necessary literacy to support its ethical use. For example, imagining an unprecedented influx of applications might lead an agency to consider AI where before they would have just stayed away from that technology.
Hello, this is Katie Ingersoll, Director of Strategy and Communications at SMU DataArts, and I'm here today with Daniel Fonner, Associate Director of Research at SMU DataArts, and today we're talking about his recent report using AI for public evaluation. Thanks for joining me, Daniel.
Glad to be here, Katie.
So, Daniel, there's a lot of information out there right now about AI, new ways to use it, as well as a lot of conversations about how to employ it ethically. Amidst all of this, what I loved about your report is that it really flips the script on a lot of the current conversation about AI. Instead of asking if AI can make decisions for us, it explores how it can help us check decisions that have already been made. It's subtle, but for me, it was a real shift in how we think about AI.
Definitely. For this project, we were thinking about using AI for public sector grant making. When we're thinking about the role of government, we want programs to be efficient. We want them to be ethical. We want them to be conducted in a way that is in line with what constituents want and how the funding essentially is spent. So when we're thinking about using AI, we want to be thinking about developing this public trust and thinking about that through evaluation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So let's stick with the grant making example, which is what this report focuses on. So I would love for you to walk me through what it would look like for a grant maker to use AI following the framework you lay out in your research. And I'll just say, we know that public agencies have really strict rules about data, so they can't just upload a bunch of sensitive grant data to an AI tool. So how do they even start?
That's a great point, especially thinking about data privacy always needs to be front and center in these types of conversations. But specifically in our report, we want to use open models. These are LLMs, in this case, large language models, that are freely available online, that we can diagnose all the components that went into creating that model. With those types of models, you can download them, run them on a local laptop, and so it provides more transparency into how the models work. They're not necessarily nearly as powerful as some of the commercial models that we use, such as ChatGPT or Claude. But in the case of government agencies using these types of models and thinking about using data security protocols to protect their data, we want to be able to use these smaller models in that way. Also, through this work, before we even put data into even a local model or an open model, we also want to remove identifying information from the data before it even goes in, just to protect the data that much more.
Okay. So they're able to feed their anonymized grant-making data into these open models, and this doesn't violate any privacy requirements. And from there, they can start to learn from past decisions?
Yeah, exactly. In the report, we tested this on a COVID relief program for arts and cultural organizations. We used the grant application data as well as the scores awarded by the human evaluators throughout the grants process. The training of the AI for this process using historical data is called supervised learning, where we have labeled data, which is data such as a grant application, and a label, that is whether they got funding or not. And we use this to inform how we want the model to perform itself. We are training the AI to make decisions in the same style as the grant making agency. And we find that our model was able to predict the decisions of the human evaluators most of the time for this program that we evaluated.
Okay, so you've basically used this supervised learning technique to replicate the decision-making processes of the agency within the AI. That's amazing. So how do you go from there to beginning to uncover biases?
This next stage is something we call algorithm auditing, where we will use a technique called counterfactual analysis, which is a lot of big words to say we're going to vary our data a little bit to see if that change impacts the outcome. So we present the model with applications from potential applicants that are entirely the same, and we only change one aspect. In the case of our research, we were looking at how changing the organization size, a small organization or a large organization, or the demographic focus of the leaders of the organization would affect the decision.
Got it. So with that key detail changed, but nothing else, seeing what the AI does can help us understand if there's any bias at play. That's so fascinating. Well, I'm thinking about this, and I can imagine that if a bias was uncovered, that would be really useful to grant makers. Would they start to consider how to mitigate it?
Hopefully. In our experiment, we actually found no specific bias related to the demographics of the organizations, but we did find that small organizations scored about 4.5% lower than their larger counterparts. When we took this finding to the funding agency that had the program, we discovered they had already created two separate tracks for large and small organizations. So we still found that potential bias, but it had been mitigated in the grant making process.
I see. So they already sort of anticipated this bias and they had already accounted for it in their program design. Well, that's a great outcome, though I can imagine cases where it might be a surprise and they would need to decide how to proceed from there.
Exactly. And this would also go back to really thinking about the expertise and the subject matter knowledge of the agencies and the humans involved in the processes. They understand their grantees, they understand their processes, so we can use that knowledge to inform what were the goals of the program and how well did the execution of the program align with those goals.
Yeah. Well, thank you for walking me through that. It's fascinating stuff. So I want to think a little bit about a different question. We've been focused on this use of AI that audits decisions, but that does leave a rather pressing question on the table. Should grant makers use AI to make grant decisions? I know the recent report doesn't focus on this, but I am curious if anything within this framework might be useful in that discussion.
Yeah, I think so. There is a lot of very genuine concern about AI being used to replace human decision making. There's also a fear that AI could be adopted before an agency really understands the technology and has the necessary literacy to support its ethical use. For example, imagining an unprecedented influx of applications might lead an agency to consider AI where before they would have just stayed away from that technology. The process used in our framework to detect bias could also be used to audit these types of AI systems. For example, a grant maker could feed a tool past application data and then compare the result to what actually happened to see if the AI is working closely with that previous decision making. Or they could use the counterfactual method we discussed earlier, change one aspect of an application, see if it changes that decision. These kinds of experiments, micro experiments, might help grant makers become better educated on the drawbacks and limitations of these tools, maybe decide to not adopt them at all, or to use them in limited ways that are specific to their needs and they are comfortable with how they're performing. We explore some of this in a follow up post on our site, along with a checklist that we're developing for grant makers to use to consider what should we be thinking about whenever we're wanting to use AI in this domain.
Yes, I read that new post, and I think the checklist especially is really helpful. So I hope that people check it out. We'll link to the report in the comments as well as the post that you described, Daniel. And I highly recommend giving it a read for anyone who is intrigued or who is just thinking through how AI can be used as they make decisions in their work. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. It's always a pleasure to talk about your work.
Thanks, Katie. I had a lot of fun as well.